privileged to have Michael Albert with us tonight for discussion. He'll be known very well to some of you in the audience. I've heard him speak myself personally a number of times. Last time was in Derry with Bridget and the whole Collaboration for Change crowd. Before that, it was in Florence at the European Social Forum. I think it was in 2004 with my father. My father's on the giveaway there, Dad. My dad's on the screen there. He's 88 years old now. He had a heart attack after Michael Albert's discussion in Florence, but he recovered, and he's here with us tonight for his second bout with Michael.
Oh my God.
I know. Yeah. But listen, I'm just going to start this off with a bit of an intro to Michael, then have him kind of come in and just, I'm just conscious that many people wouldn't know Michael's work or Michael's activism. Just spend a bit of time understanding who he is and sort of the motivation and where his analysis comes from as well. But anyone who registered would have read about Michael. He's a long-time activist, prolific author, over 20 books and countless articles. He's also a publisher, founded the South End Press in 1977. He was a co-author with Robert Handel of the Vision for Participatory Economics and Participatory Society. He's a founder of various projects and institutions, including ZMAG and the sort of ecosystem that exists around ZMAG. So Z Video, Z Blog, Z Forum, etc., and led to the foundation of the International Organization for Participatory Society with members like Noam Chomsky and others, who's a longtime collaborator with Michael. And Michael's currently staff at ZNet and a member of a writing collective, which Bridget's also a member of Collective 20. In 2007, Michael published his memoirs called Remembering Tomorrow, From SDS, which is Students for a Democratic Society, to Life After Capitalism. Impressive life's work there, Michael, I would say. I can remember myself, Michael, in the 90s, really whenever started to connect with other activists online for the first time. For me, ZNet was really the go-to place where you found connections with other progressive movements across the world, and attractive writers like John Pilger, Arundhati Roy, Chomsky, Naomi Klein, a rake of others. And just kind of trying to understand what led to the inception or the foundation of ZNet and those, and probably just bringing it all backwards in terms of where you came from, get a sense of where you're from. I mean, did you have a political upbringing in the family or in your younger years?
No, thank you for all the kind words. No, I didn't. My parents were liberal in the U.S., Democratic Party, but nothing resembling activism, much less radical activism, much less revolutionary activism, nothing like that. I went off to school, and that's mainly where it happened at MIT, because that was Cambridge in the Massachusetts, and it was very, very active in those days. I was in the class of 1969, a long time ago. And, Noam was teaching there, and so he became a close friend, and I learned a lot from him and from various other people. You probably know Howard Zinn. He was at Boston University. And, of course, involvement in all those movements.
Was there a trigger? I mean, that was around the time of course, the Vietnam War, a lot of student activism in the 1960s. How did you fall in with the likes of Student Democratic Society? Because I believe you studied physics at MIT.
Yeah, that's true. I was destined to be a physicist, but it didn't happen because the activism and the war and the activity got in the way, and I was so involved in all of that I couldn't do physics anymore. It just didn't seem remotely sensible anymore. I don't know how to answer, because I don't think we want to do biography. Partly I was radicalized by experiences with the school, with the way it was organized and the way it ran and the behavior patterns and what went on, and partly by the war. The war was certainly a big factor for me, and then the civil rights movement and the Black Power and so on. And yes, I was involved in SDS. Our SDS chapter at MIT was called Rosa Luxemburg SDS. So maybe you can tell impact of
Slant.
Zinn and Chomsky on the rest. I mean, we were, we did sort of know what we were doing better than some. I'll give you one story. You know, the trouble is, if I start in the stories, people can ask for that, and I might not be able to do what you.
I'll keep going with the story. That's good. That's good.
All right. So people probably know who the weathermen were in the United States. So that was one part of the American left at that time. A relatively small part in numbers. Actually, an actually small part in numbers. They were part of SDS. SDS had various sectors of it, and weathermen were the most violent. I think is a very fair characterization, and also a little bit berserk. And I was very militant at that time, and they tried to recruit me. And when they tried to recruit me, because I knew some of them, a number of them, when they tried to recruit me, I went to Chomsky, and I asked him, does this make any sense? Because I was dubious, but I'd ask him. And no one hates to give advice, strategic advice, because he feels like he doesn't have a lot of basis for doing that. You know, he feels like he can talk about the things he can talk about, but not that. So he's very loath to do that. But he did in this instance, very succinctly. He said to me, what will happen is they'll blow up some bathrooms or other such things. Some of them will blow themselves up, and they will only damage the left. And that was the extent of his advice. And it was also an accurate prognostication of exactly what happened with weathermen, in my opinion. And so despite all my militance and everything else, I didn't join. I was in the parts of SDS that were militant and active, but not in that violent fashion of, you know, creating a bomb in your basement and then putting it in the bathroom someplace and blowing the bathroom up and thinking you were overthrowing the empire. That means. Anyway.
Well, can you give us a flavor of the type of activism that you were involved with through SDS? Because were you president of the Student Society at that time?
No, not nationally. I was involved mostly with local SDS. The kind of actions we did were everything from sit-ins and disruptions and mass marches and rallies and organized riots. You know, I organized actual riots. I'm not proud of it now particularly, although in those days, this is the way the calculation went. Cambridge was a lot further along politically than most of the country. So we had many more activists, many more people who were socialists and were revolutionary. We used to call it the totality of oppression, which was race, class, gender, and power. A little ahead of our time in that sense. And so we used to call it that. And we had lots more people turning out for things. And at one point in time, we did this. We had this discussion, basically. What should we do? Should we proceed as we've been slowly and develop, slowly is not exactly right, but at the pace we were going, and develop massive student organizations on the campuses and try and develop community organizations and so on? Or should we go berserk? The logic for going berserk was it would spur people throughout the rest of the country on. In other words, they would see this level of disruption and of conflict, struggle, which would become visible all over the country, and it would spur them on. So it was a strategic calculation. We weren't just sort of thinking to ourselves, well, it would be more fun to go wild in the streets than to organize face-to-face and slowly but surely build up commitment and awareness. And we opted for the former, and that was a mistake that I will never, be happy about. But we did, and so we created a whole lot of disruption, and people all over the country saw it, but probably more people were turned off by it than were turned on by it. And we lost the opportunity to create the institutions as a model for other places also. That is what the 60s failed at. So the 60s did a tremendous job of mobilizing lots of people, and it did a tremendous job of affecting mindsets, but it did a piss poor job of creating institutional lasting structures to continue to battle on and on. And, you know, the same kind of problem exists today.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of getting to that point, looking at the activism there, because, you know, I was going through some of the articles that you wrote in preparation for this, and there's one you wrote in 2018 that was called "How We Elderly Activists Failed." And there's a quote in it, which kind of resonates, but it says, "We were delusionally visionless, not insightfully visionary. As opponents ridiculed our not having answers for the future of everything, we began to celebrate not having answers for the future of anything. So whatever paths you young folks discover and whatever new choices you make, please avoid our errors, lest they undercut your aspirations as they did ours." And I'm just wondering, you know, with the formation of South End Press in 1977, looking at it from afar a bit, you can see a lot of the activism that you've set up or engaged in seems to be creating space for discussion, debates around vision that can then kind of filter into strategy as well. So just thinking about the role of vision, and I suppose how that percolates into different strategies and social movements, and how that kind of experience through SDS and the universities then led to trying to establish institutions like South End Press.
Well, back then, people would say to us, "What do you want?" very belligerently, because we'd be saying, "We don't want racism. We don't want capitalism. We don't want all kinds of things." And obviously the war was a central thing, you know, end the war. And they would say, "Well, what do you want? We hear what you don't want, but you don't want anything. You have no alternatives." And we tended to get defensive about that and to think that their motivation in saying that, it wasn't a sincere question most of the time, or it didn't feel like a sincere question. And so we would get belligerent and we wouldn't ask ourselves, wait a minute, do they have a right to be asking this? Answer yes. Should we have an answer to this? Answer yes. We didn't do that. And so if you look back, and actually if you look now, there aren't that many movements who are very clear about or even focused on answering the question, what do you want, beyond saying, well, we want freedom, we want justice, we want equity, we want people to be able to control their own lives, and so on and so forth, all of which is valid and real and important. But the people asking those questions, the people who have difficult lives and who may be working 2 jobs and who are under financial pressures and who, you know, they are saying, what do you want that could deliver that? What do you want that actually should give me reason to think that your movements and joining your movements would be part of a process that would lead to freedom and justice and equity and whatever, and spelling out what it means. And after a while, I began to think they were right and we were wrong in our attitude toward vision, that it was a fair question, and that it was a responsible question, and that people had every right and every reason to not want to be part of a movement which didn't seem to be headed for anything except complaining about what was, however justified all those complaints were, which they were, right? But it's not enough. And so that set me on the path, I suppose, rightly or wrongly, of trying to contribute, as you say, on the one hand, means to have those discussions or to pursue those thoughts, and on the other hand, my own pursuit of that. I've spent a whole lot of time trying to develop and offer vision, meaning not a blueprint, right? Not some kind of detailed picture of 50 years or 100 years in the future, or anything like that. The task is to figure out structures, institutions that allow us to live and that facilitate people controlling their own lives, that facilitate the, equity and so on. What do you want instead of the economy? Okay, you don't want capitalism, but what do you want? Do you want what they had in the Soviet Union? That's a fair question. Do you want what they had in China? That's a fair question. It's not unreasonable that people, if they think you want something that they don't think is any better, don't join. And so that became a real significant focus of my own efforts anyway.
Did that kind of growth, or I suppose evolution in thinking that insights, did that set you apart from the activists that you had in the 60s, early 70s?
Well, look, again, rightly or wrongly, for the most part, yes. The number, I would often give talks and I would say something like this. Suppose you created a pile, just a pile of all the talks, all the essays, all the books, all of the, all the kinds of films, whatever, all the communications that are about what's wrong with society and why it's wrong. And you were to create that. And I used to say, well, it would reach to the moon. It would certainly reach a long, long way. And then I would say, suppose you created a stack of all of the products of left thought, speaking, plays, films, whatever you want to talk about, same as the other pile, but now answering the question, what do you want institutionally, right? And I used to say, maybe it would reach your knee. And it seemed to me that while that first stack is very important, the second stack is what's missing. And and just saying another world is possible doesn't convince anybody that another world is possible. Mm-hmm. My own feeling is that most people out there are blocked from listening to the left by believing that another world isn't possible deep down inside. And I even believe that's true for most of the people on the left. That is, or I don't know about most, but a great many people on the left deep down inside also doubt the possibility of another world. And there's no point in being strategic, in being careful, in being disciplined, if that's the problem, if that's what you think. One more example of how I used to, speaking to students, I would sometimes ask people, and think about this for a minute, suppose you were going to play one-on-one basketball with LeBron James. You're really going to do that. It's set up for some reason, and you have to play one-on-one basketball with LeBron James. I'm hoping you know who LeBron James is. But anyway.
I'm assuming they just think he's a very good basketball player. So
yeah, arguably the best basketball player in the world. And you're going to play one-on-one with him. And now what I'd like to know, and you have 30 days to prepare, right? 30 days to prepare to do it. And it's going to be on television. What do you do for those 30 days? And if you think about this for a little while, I think that what you come away with is, well, it's a waste of time to practice. If you're going to lose 100-0 if you don't practice, you might lose 100-2 or 100-4 if you do practice. And that's not going to make it. Nobody's going to even be able to see the difference. It's irrelevant. So what you might think about is, I should think about how I'm going to look, what I'm going to wear, how I'm going to comport myself, things like that, but nothing to do with winning, because winning is out of reach. And I began to think that that's the way a lot of us approach activism, that we're worried about how we look, that we're concerned about feeling good, not that there's anything wrong with feeling good, right? That we're concerned about interacting with others and having a community of people that's supportive, but not winning, because we don't think winning is possible deep down. We don't say it, but a lot of us don't think it's really possible. And I think it's possible. And so I concern myself with, okay, what do you do when you're winning? One more story. Not that long ago, I was in Greece. Remember when there were the uprisings before Syriza, and talking to activists, and they told me that at the height of the demonstrations, 40% of the country was in the street. 40%, right? And they said that at these demonstrations, it got to the point where there was only one thing left to do. I mean, people in the street, marching, rallying, fighting, there was only one thing left to do, and it was to occupy the political buildings. It was to occupy the government, to occupy the state house, to occupy the court. And they told me that they sat around and they thought about this and they realized that they had no fucking idea what to do if they did that. They didn't have the foggiest notion of what they could do next to have it be anything other than a debacle. And they backed off. And that's sort of interesting. And I guess what I'd like to see is movements of 40% of the country or 50% of the country that have a vision and that have clear understanding and that realize what you do in the workplaces and in the schools and in the families and in the community centers and everything else when you're in a position to move forward. Anyway.
I remember reading one time, it's on that point, that talk you were given one time, do you remember the saying from the kind of Cultural Revolution about dare to struggle, dare to win, and being initially perplexed by it, but then realizing the importance of the saying?
Well, it wasn't just, I sort of thought to myself, dare to struggle. Okay, I get that. This was a Chinese slogan, but it was adopted in the American left also. So dare to struggle, that's totally understandable. There's risk, there's possible losses, you have to dare to do that. Dare to win? After a while, I started thinking about that. What the hell does that mean? Why is winning something that you have to dare to do? But it is, and it's what people don't do. There's some wisdom there. Or so it seemed to me.
Just moving into that then, so you were one of the founders of the participatory economics movement, which is, whenever I read it, it's much larger than participatory economics in the sense it applies to polity and kinship, gender, everything. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that movement?
Well, just clarify something. Are you asking me to describe the vision, or are you asking me to talk about the people who support? I'm not sure what you're looking for. The
vision, Michael.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, participatory economics means to be an alternative to capitalism, an alternative, and for that matter, an alternative to what I call coordinatorism, what other people call market socialism or centrally planned socialism. And the idea here, again, it's not a blueprint. The idea is, what are the core institutions that need to change in order to have an economy which is worthy, an economy which really serves its workers and its consumers and its citizens. And socialists understand that one of the things that you have to do is get rid of private ownership of the means of production. And that's true. You do. You can't have a viable, worthy economy if a relatively small number of people, 0.1%, own the means by which all production occurs. Then they're going to dominate every aspect of life. So you have to get rid of that. So that's long since known and is true. And I would imagine people probably agree with that much. But there then arises, that's sort of what we put forward. But that's not a vision. That's just, okay, we don't want that. Even to say we don't want markets or central planning, and that's a much bigger step in terms of understanding, is not a positive vision. It's just a critique. I don't want markets. I think markets are someday in the future, if we don't blow up the world, markets will be understood to have been the single worst creation of humanity, the single most harmful thing that humans ever generated. So I'm a market abolitionist, I suppose you could say. So if you don't like markets because they distort human personality and because they orient production toward ecologically disastrous results, and because they divide people into classes and so on, and you don't like central private ownership for those reasons, so you have some things that you don't like. Participatory economics meant to describe institutions that would be positive, that would be viable and would be workable. Let me say one more thing before and it won't take that long to give the institutions, because there's only a few that are critical, I think. But the one more thing that came around the time when participatory economics was being developed was an attention to class and what it meant, and whether our prior understanding of class was sufficient. And what we began to feel was that the answers to those questions, that last question, was no. That between labor and capital, capital being the people who own all the workplaces and the resources and so on, and labor being the people who work and sell their labor, their ability to do work to those owners and get a wage for it, that there was another sector of people who work, but who are very different from the rest of workers and different from owners. And what we began to feel is that there were people who, by virtue of what they did, also their prior education, but by virtue of what they did, had a kind of monopoly on empowering work. What do I mean by empowering work? On tasks, the doing of which gave these people confidence, social contacts, access to levers of decision-making, information, and the like, that contribute to being empowered, capable of exerting yourself. And another set of workers, of people who do work, did tasks that were disempowering, tasks that divided you, that reduced your connections, that isolated you from decision-making of any kind, that reduced your confidence, that basically disempowered. And we call the former the coordinator class, and it's about 20% of the workforce. And the latter, the working class, and it's about 80% of the workplace. And we began to think about that, and then we began to look at what was called socialism, what existed in various countries, 20th century socialism, some people call it. And we began to think about it and to think, well, wait a second. What seems to have really happened here is out with the old boss and with the new boss, for those who like rock and roll, out with the capitalist, but not in with the working class per se, all the people functioning in the economy, but instead in with 20% who would rule the new economy. And so once you have that kind of perspective and you start thinking about positive economic vision, desirable economic vision, it becomes pretty straightforward, I think. You have to get rid of private ownership because you can't have, 1% at the top lording it over everybody. But then you have to get rid of something else. You have to get rid of the division of labor, which sets 20% above 80%. And what is that division of labor? Well, it's just dividing up the tasks of work in such a way that 20% monopolize all the empowering stuff, and 80% get stuck with the disempowering stuff. And so if you're going to undo that, you have to find a different way of doing the division of labor. So participatory economics says, let's come back to that division of labor. The first thing it says is no private ownership. There's either no ownership or everybody owns everything. Ownership is not a factor. It becomes a null factor in your activity in the economy. There's just it has no bearing on anything. So everybody owns everything accomplishes that. And then the next thing was, well, how should people be remunerated? What should people get income for? And in current economic discourse, there are only a few things that are understood to be possible for that. That is, you can be remunerated for what your property produces, profits. Okay, so we rule that out. We already ruled that out because nobody has the property, but nonetheless, we don't like it, so we don't want that. The next was, you could be remunerated for what you contribute by your efforts to the social product. So maybe you're making bicycles and you just make a whole lot of bicycles. You don't get back from the social product a whole lot of bicycles. You get back food and clothing and whatever it is that you desire, but the volume that you get back is determined by your productivity, by the amount you contribute by your efforts to the social product. Well, when we thought about that, we didn't like that either, for a number of reasons. It rewards you more if you have better equipment than if you have worse. And we didn't think people deserved more for being lucky and having better equipment. It rewards you more if you happen to produce something that's more valued. We didn't think you should get more for that. It rewards you more if, like LeBron James, you're born with incredible endowment. That is biological endowment. Some leftists don't like this, but trust me, none of us could play basketball like LeBron James if we spent the next 100 years practicing. He starts off with, you know, it's true. Noam Chomsky starts off with a brain that most of us, dare I say all of us, don't have, right? And I don't think people should be rewarded for luck in the genetic lottery, right? You're born with something. You're born Mozart. You're born with this musical talent. Why should you be rewarded on top of having been lucky in the genetic lottery? So we ruled out that. And the next thing you could be remunerated for is what actually happens in market societies. Yes, some people are rewarded for the product of their property, profits. And yes, some people do get more by virtue of the fact that they have these inborn talents or skills or capacities. But in a market economy, it's because those things convey power. In a marketing economy, you get rewarded for your bargaining power. If you have more bargaining power, you get more. And this, I mean, if I'm going on too long, tell me.
No, go ahead. We've got a question coming in a second.
This is germane even in, so for instance, does LeBron James earn all that he contributes to the output of society? No, he doesn't earn it all at all, right? Owners take some of it. Nike takes some of it, or whoever his shoe manufacturer is. The people who own the basketball team take some of it. The other owners of NBA teams take some of it. The truth is, although most leftists would be loath to admit this, his contribution to the social output, to what people want and get pleasure out of, is really enormous. I mean, think of Mozart. If Mozart got everything that his music was worth, I don't know, his great-great-grandchildren would own the United Kingdom. I mean, it really worth a lot. Why don't they get what their output is equivalent to? Well, because it's really all about bargaining power. So it's a thug's economy. Al Capone used to say, Al Capone was an American thug, an American killer, criminal. And he used to say, I really love America. I just love the United States, because in the United States, you get what you can take. That's more sophisticated than most of the economists in the United States, right? Because it's accurate. It is the way that the system works. So what's and now I'll go quickly through the institutions. So what are the new institutions? Well, collective ownership of everything. So that's no problem. Remuneration for how long you work, how hard you work, and the onerousness of the conditions under which you work. And that's all, right? Not for property, not for output, not even for output. So market socialists get nervous about this. This is not the traditional socialist formulation. For how long you work, how hard you work, and the onerousness of the conditions under which you work, as long as you're producing something that is socially desired, that people want. Division of labor. The corporate division of labor, 20% get the empowering work, 80% get rote, repetitive work, is gone. Everybody gets a share of a mix of responsibilities such that everybody's empowerment effect, the effect of their work on their ability to participate and contribute and have opinions and express them and pursue them, is comparable. So we call it a balanced job complex. And then we replace central planning and markets with something called participatory planning, and therein lies the name participatory economics, or participatory socialism, some people call it. And that's all. That, I think, I could be completely wrong about this, but that, I think, is both necessary and sufficient to have a classless economy that works and that produces and that delivers and that meets people's needs and their desires. And then beyond that, there would be all sorts of additional attributes that are worked out in practice. So that's participatory economics.
And how, I mean, looking at, so, there's a critique of capitalism, critique of real existing socialism, 20th century socialism, market socialism, what it is, a critique, and you have a proposal which isn't a blueprint, but tries to sense institutionalize values around solidarity, all these type of issues. How does that sort of vision then have a practical impact on strategy? How do you get there?
Well, yeah, and there's two parts to that question. One part is, how does it get adopted by enough people so it has a practical impact?
Yeah.
And if I had the answer to that, I'd be a very happy camper. I don't have the answer to that. I know what some of the obstacles are. And one very big obstacle, I think, not everybody agrees with me about this, not even everybody who supports the vision agrees with me about this, but I think one large obstacle is that the left writ large is to a considerable extent a vehicle for the coordinator class's domination, not for all who contribute in the economy. You can see it. I think Marxism-Leninism is the ideology of the coordinator class. So I think it's true for that part of the left. I think you see it, you can find it in unions and in various organizations. And so it's very difficult for something like this, which simply, I mean, you would understand why, anybody would understand why in a capitalist corporate media institution, there would not be a lot of attention to socialism, even of the 20th century variety, because it would threaten the interests of the people who control that institution. Well, I think the same is true for participatory economics, that it has an uphill climb because it threatens the interests of the people who, by and large, are in positions of decision-making authority throughout left media. But as far as what kind of impact it would have on strategy, it's a big question, but okay, take an example. Suppose there's a struggle for a higher minimum wage in some institution, so in some workplace, or just for higher wages, period. A struggle around income. Well, one way to pursue such a struggle is to basically say, we want X, let's say in the United States, $15 an hour, $20 an hour, whatever it is. And we believe in X for the following reasons, and we're going to fight for X, and we fight for X more or less fiercely, hopefully really aggressively. And then we win it, and then we go home. Because all we've done is legitimate X, $15 an hour, right? But if you have a vision, and if the vision says, maybe it says something else, but if it says people should be remunerated for duration, intensity, and onerousness of work, then in the course of fighting for $15 or $20 an hour, you're trying to push that understanding. So to use an easy case, if you're in a university, you're asking why the custodians are earning less than the professors. Now, you can see how some people on the left might not like that, right? But I think that the custodians work often longer hours at worse conditions, right? More onerous, longer and harder than lots and lots of professors. And in fact, the professors who work the least hard and the least number of hours, by and large, are going to be the ones who earn the most. And why would that be? It's because it's power, and their bargaining power is such that they can raise their incomes, and they can also improve their conditions, and they can also diminish their work hours. And the custodians with virtually no power get the exact opposite result: lower wages, worse conditions, more onerous, etc. So if your movement is part of what guides it, and only part, because there's also issues of gender and race and power, but if your movement is guided by a kind of a participatory economic approach, then your campaign about income would be like that. Your campaign in the workplace about decision making would talk about self-management. That's, I guess I didn't even put that into the brief nutshell characterization of participatory economics, but it believes in self-management, which is that the people who are affected by decisions should make them with roughly an input proportionate to the degree they're affected. So you might be fighting in the workplace for something, and you might be simultaneously trying to form a workers' council, and you might be fighting for higher wages, and you might be simultaneously trying to create a situation in which, when you win the $15 an hour, instead of going home satisfied, you're happy that you won, but you don't go home satisfied. You now want $40 an hour or whatever it is. You now are fighting for more. And that's the difference between reformism and trying to build a process that leads to really fundamental change.
You can see how that would work in sort of the daily kind of mundane struggle, say, for example, a labor union, trade union, and how that would change or alter the demands being made by the shop steward on the shop floor. How that kind of look for equal pay. It is not an end goal in itself, but is much more of a transformative demand. You know, but I'm just wondering, you know, it's certainly not in my experience, and I dare say everyone that isn't what's happening right now. No. The institutions and the organizations that sort of represent progressive voices, that thinking isn't there, never mind the organization that can support those type of strategies. And I'm just wondering, you know, given the lens, I would like to kind of move into kind of where the US is at right now, and even stuff around COVID. But, you know, where do you, it's not a personal question as such, but it's just politically, I suppose, where do you see the prospects for change currently? You know, in the sense of, where do you get hope from? And I don't mean an emotional hope very much so, but latent potential. You know, there's potential there for change.
Yeah. In the United States, because that's where I am, right? Black Lives Matter was enormous. It wasn't just a good movement. It wasn't just a large movement. It was enormous, right? The scale of it took everybody by surprise. And interestingly, it moved from, not fully, but it did move from a focus on the violence of the cops, which obviously needs attention, right? I mean, it's not as if it's not important, but it did move from that to institutional racism, to racism writ larger. And that's you know, a part of what we're talking about. If there's a clear vision for that aspect of life, call it intercommunalism, which the Black Panthers once upon a time called it, then it could inform that process. And so, you know,
do you mean things like when they
Sanders is a mind-boggling outcome. Corbyn in England, but that's less of a shock, I think. What Sanders did in the United States was just absolutely amazing. And what it uncovered, which I thought was there, I have to admit, was the receptivity of large sectors of the public to a clear, sensible presentation of positive aspirations. Sanders at one point had a commercial that played on TV. And in the commercial, I got to try and get this right. I'm not going to, I apologize. But the essence of it was, Sanders was saying to you watching the TV, so you're watching, I'm Sanders, you're watching me on the TV. And he's basically saying to the audience, can you feel the same sympathy, the same empathy, the same caring for somebody across town as for your next door neighbor, for somebody across the world as for somebody in your family? This is on American television. This to me was I mean, I just started crying watching the TV, but it was such a step forward in terms of, you know, what was being said. And then at the same time, he sort of, his process and what went on just simply eliminated the word socialism from the stack of things for which you could be burned at the stake. And that was a big change. I mean, a lot of us have been trying to do it for decades. And it happened so fast. Now it might revert, but the speed with which those two things happened, the speed with which Sanders became the most popular politician in the country, and he was, more than you can even see, because the people who don't vote and who don't fill out the questionnaires, he was more popular among them than he was among those who do. So his support was even wider and larger than people could realize. The institutions made it impossible for him to win, or prevented him from winning. I don't really think it was impossible, but it prevented it. So those things give hope. I think that there's more attention now to trying to think about what we want than there has been in 50 years. That doesn't mean there's enough, but it is increasing, and that's hopeful. There's more attention to another facet of what it requires to win, I think, which is that economics doesn't trump everything. Gender doesn't trump everything. The word Trump here meaning not his name, but, Trump, dominate. Race doesn't trump everything. Power, an anarchist kind of position, doesn't trump everything. There are still people who believe in each of those. There are people who believe, well, economics is everything. You do everything else in terms of economics. And the same, there are feminists who believe that's the way you should approach things, except with gender in the priority position. Well, it's becoming clear to lots and lots and lots of people that that's a dead end. That trying to put anything in that kind of priority is a mistake. And that what's needed is a perspective that elevates all of these areas of life to fundamental and doesn't worry about, more or less or anything like that, but worries instead about trying to find a mechanism by which the movements that each spawns can be mutually supportive. And that's a winning path.
Well, you mentioned Trump, we might as well move on to that.
Okay.
But in the kind of, when myself and Fergal met you in preparation for this, you said something that was very, I suppose, real eye-opener to me, was that you hadn't before voted in presidential elections, but you would be voting in this one. And I wonder, just the phenomenon of Trump, obviously it's just not a personality, but there's a context and a background to it. What is your motivation for voting now?
Well, honestly, I'm not totally sure I will vote, but it's only because I'm in the state of Massachusetts and he's going to get annihilated. Will I find my way to the voting place and risk COVID and everything else when I know that he's going to get demolished in Massachusetts? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. But if I was in Ohio, or if I was in Pennsylvania, or if I was in Florida, I would vote. And I would, why? Donald Trump is not just another fellow. He's not just another thug. He's not just another asshole. He's not just another racist, sexist, narcissist, all the things that he's called. He's effective. And that's the thing that matters more than all the rest. I know it's incomprehensible, but just think about it. He is the president of the United States. He did win, albeit he lost by 3 million votes, but in the way the US operates, he became president. And he's still there, and he is still in a position to potentially win again. It could happen. It really could happen. So why is that such a bad thing? It's such a bad thing because, I mean, I hope I don't have to make this case at any length. He's such a bad thing because him in the Oval Office and his party in power right now is an existential threat to each of your lives. That's why it has to be stopped. Not just to Americans, not just to people in the United States, to the whole fucking world. Because of what it means for global climate concerns, global ecological concerns, global war and peace concerns, the rise of fascism in other places, which Trump spurs and facilitates in a tremendous degree. I doubted if you'd have Boris. Maybe you would. I don't know, but he's certainly spurred on by Trump, and he's certainly facilitated by Trump. So it's an election like none I've ever seen. I think it's arguably an election like none the United States has ever had. And that's why it's important that he lose. That doesn't mean Biden's going to deliver anything wonderful. He actually will be more receptive to left pressure, and he will deliver some things, and they're significant. But it's not participatory economics. It's not participatory kinship. It's not a revolution. But that's why the slogan is dump Trump and battle Biden. Right? That was the slogan that we put on an open letter that we sent around. I think it had 55 people or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna
let me just say one more thing about this,
yes.
Because there are a lot of people in the United States who aren't going to vote for Biden, who hate Trump, and who are socialists or feminists or anti-racists or anarchists, particularly anarchists. Actually, there are a lot of people. Hopefully that number is declining daily, and I think it is. But there are a lot of people who feel like, on the one hand, I can't stand the idea of voting for Biden, this neoliberal, atrocity. And on the other hand, it's not that much of a difference. After all, we've been saying for 40 years, Tweedledum and Tweedledee about the candidates. And we've been saying, look, we really have one party in the United States that has two wings, right? It's one corporate party, one capitalist party with two wings that prove themselves to be useful to those at the top. And that's all been true. And I've said it. And, somebody like Chomsky has said it. Half these people learned it from, if not me, perhaps, but certainly Noam. But things change. And right now, the Republican Party is not that. It simply is not that. It is something off the rails. Is it currently fascist? I don't know. It's doing any number of things that are characteristic of fascism. It's making gestures that are really characteristic of fascism. But it doesn't have to be fascist for it to be so disgusting that you have to vote it out. And that's where we are. I guess you might as well, 3 weeks from today will be the election. It will be, I have no idea. If you go by polls and you go by that stuff, Biden will win handily. He'll win the overall vote. Clinton won by 3 million. He'll win by 5, maybe 7, and he'll win the Electoral College handily too. But you can't go by just the polls, because Trump is the president, and Trump will do anything. And so, who knows what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks? And on the night, I'll make the night a little easier for you. I assume you'll maybe watch the returns. I don't know whether you should watch the returns, but you should be worried about them, because this election, like I said, it may seem arrogant for me to say so, but regrettably, because it shouldn't be the case, that the imperial monster is so powerful that it's arguably the most important election for people's lives all over the planet, but it is. And if you watch, don't get upset when Trump is well ahead, because he will be on election night. If he's not, it's all over and Biden has won. But he'll probably be well ahead, because there are way more Democratic Party mail-in votes than Republican Party mail-in votes. And so this introduces one of the problems. Late in the night, Trump will say, oh, look at this. I'm way ahead, or I'm ahead. Doesn't even have to be way ahead. I'm ahead. Let's shut it down. I win, shut it down. That's one disaster. The next disaster is, the stuff before the election, I suppose. I can't predict that. The next disaster is Biden wins the Electoral College, and Trump says, well, it's cheating. It's all cheating. The mail votes don't count. All the Republican governors, and there's a shitload of them, should intervene and replace the Electoral College electors with people beholden to me, Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump somehow wins an election that he lost on every stage. The other possibility is that he just says, I don't care, it's a scam, I'm not leaving. All these things are quite possible. I mean, this is new to American history. It hasn't been the case ever. All these are possible. And what will happen in the event of any of them, I'm not saying they will happen. I actually think maybe not, but I'm in a minority there on the left now. And in any case, we have to be prepared. And so people across the United States are preparing in different ways. I'll tell you in all honesty, a lot of people going out and buying guns in huge numbers on all sides. And that's not good. And it is not a way to deal with the situation and have anything good come out of it. But that is happening. On the other hand, a lot of people on the left are agitating, speaking and writing and so on, but also organizing to have turnout on election day and to have turnout after, if necessary, of absolutely huge numbers of people, millions upon millions of people. And that is a good way. And we'll see. Nobody knows. There's just no way to know what exactly is going to happen. I mean, you can think of it, and one way to think of it is, when Sanders ran, there was no way to know except everybody would have predicted he'd get nowhere or not very far. So it tells you how ignorant we are of some aspects, especially of short-run outcomes, right? We make believe we know a lot, but there's a lot of things about which we don't know that much, and you can't because they're so volatile and they can change so quickly. I mean, I feel like I understand institutions, but the whole population? No, it's not that.
Michael, we have
I don't mean to get you sad. The other possibility here is that Biden wins and all that momentum for dealing with Trump quickly turns to dealing with Biden. And if that happens, we're going to be in better shape in the United States than we've been in 50 years. That's how much of a thing this thing rests on. How much of a sway there is. Not because Biden is good, but because the movements will be powerful and they will affect the outcomes.
Michael, we have a number of questions here. I just want to kind of open it up for people, some of the audience to ask questions. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you to come in and take your mics off and ask the questions. Sarah, do you want to come in first? Just a question around Black Lives Matter movement. Can you do it okay? There you are.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Brilliant.
Yes.
Lovely.
That's great, Michael. Thanks very much. It was so interesting to hear your point of view. Black Lives Matter obviously had a big impact worldwide, and here in Ireland as well. It kind of it made us examine ourselves and our privilege and the institutions that we have here. I suppose we came to realise on a wider scale that there is institutionalised racism. There's a deep-seated institutionalised inequality, on a class level, but in particular to do with race. And there was there was a right-wing rally not long ago, like a couple of months ago, and one of the speakers at that turned out to be a case assessor for asylum seekers who was on a panel for the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I just found that really shocking. But that type of open racism is accepted within the civil service. And I just was wondering what your thoughts would be on kind of tackling that deep-seated inequality, those kind of, civil servants who've been working in those decision-making roles for, a long time. How do we start to change that culture? How do we start to open that up and to make people examine themselves and their privilege on a wider scale? Be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Sarah.
Well, I mean, as far as people in power being racist, Trump is an outright racist. So there's somebody in power, it does exist all over. How you combat it, I think, well, I'll tell you some of what happened with Black Lives Matter and where it could go. You all saw that, there were people in the street in many places throughout the United States, and some of it was physical confrontation, some of it was just huge numbers of people, and it had a very dramatic effect. Which, to give you just one instance of it, in the United States on the TV there are sports shows, and so on these shows there will be commentator talking about sports, and ordinarily they would be talking just about sports. And during Black Lives Matter, both on radio and on TV, these sports shows have huge audiences of working class audiences and other constituencies as well, coordinated class as well, but they do reach into the working class. And these shows were talking about racism. And they were even talking about tactics and the necessity of resisting and so on and so forth. So that's another example of the speed with which huge numbers of people in motion sort of have a ripple effect, which begins to penetrate and be heard through even mainstream mechanisms, much less, their own organizing. So what my answer is, it's probably not going to be there's nothing different about it. The answer is movements that are huge are critical. And that means movements which welcome new people, which reach out. Our movements too often announce a demonstration and go to it, right? And so who goes to it? Well, the people who went to the last one. In other words, it's not organizing, it's sort of assembling, right? It's calling forth what's there. What's necessary is to organize. What's necessary is to go out and talk to the people who disagree with us. What's necessary, say in the United States, is to talk to Trump supporters, not just to talk to people who agree about what we're going to do next. The trick is to get more people. That's the crucial foundation point. Whether we're talking about race or we're talking about class or we're talking about gender, it doesn't matter what it is. The first issue is that our movements have to empower people. They have to bring people in and incorporate them. We know that a racist movement is not going to attract blacks in the United States. The 60s taught people that. We haven't fully dealt with it, but we've done a lot to deal with it. And the same thing about a sexist movement not attracting women. By and large, there's not too much understanding that a classist movement won't attack the working class. A movement that feels like Oxford or Cambridge, right? A movement whose manner, whose culture, whose taste, whose preferences are professional, are coordinator class, are, right? And which frowns on what working class people do and like in order to survive a sick society, right? So they're warranted. It frowns on sports. It frowns on TV. It frowns on the places where people eat who don't have a lot of money. And that dynamic, I think, has been quite powerful in hurting our ability to build large movements and our ability for those movements to elevate their members into participating and leading. And those seem to me to be the steps that are necessary for winning anything at all. Whatever you want to talk about. If you're trying to, there's one other ingredient, I suppose. Suppose you're trying to win a stoplight, at a corner where cars are, there's no light and it's dangerous. And so the community wants to win a stoplight. How do they do that? Well, they get more and more people involved and they get out in the streets. And what do they have to do? They have to raise the cost of not putting in the stoplight high enough so that the people with their finger on the button, stoplight or not, agree to put in the stoplight. That's what you have to do to win anything. Higher wages, affirmative action, to remove racist structures, whatever it is, short of a revolution where the people are in command, short of that, you have to create a condition in which those who are making the decisions decide that it is too costly to not give in, right? And what does that for people is not that the movement throws rocks, right? That plays into their hands. It is not that the movement is eloquent. It is not that the movement makes an appeal that is convincing. It's that the movement is huge and the movement threatens to get bigger and bigger. And that's the threat that causes people to give in. And so Black Lives Matter didn't win very fundamental things because in many ways, it wasn't yet oriented to try to win fundamental things, but it won a lot of things it aimed at. And that was because those in power looked out the window and said to themselves, holy shit, it's getting too big, it's getting too angry, and it's beginning to broaden its focus. And these are the things that are threatening, right? And so my answer to the question is basically that. It's not anything new and different. I mean, it's just that we have to do it. And doing it isn't easy, and sometimes it's uncomfortable. But we have to.
There's another couple of questions here, Michael. I'm going to bring my mate Corky in here. Peter, do you want to ask your question there?
Sure. Hey, Michael. I think you might have answered this already just in your very last statement about, people looking out the window and seeing movements grow. But I guess one of the things that's always intrigued me was the 72 election, and I think of the parallels with today, where you've got a very strong movement, anti-war movements, anti-poverty movements, and you had McGovern running against Nixon, of all people, and you think, well, that's a slam dunk, to use your basketball terminology. But, there's a situation where you feel, how can we not win, right? What happened in 72? And, I wonder, did that change the movement, that outcome? And given that it was such a bad outcome, but also, is there anything we can learn from that 72 election?
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
I was involved at that time. I have to admit, I didn't vote for McGovern because I was like the people who were now saying, never Biden, right? Even though McGovern was considerably better than Biden and considerably short of Sanders. He wasn't Sanders. If Sanders had been running, then I would have voted, I think anyway, I like to think. But what we can learn is that when we do a demonstration, when we do an action, when we do a meeting, whatever it is that we do, we are pretty good, often really good, about thinking about how does it affect the people there, right? In other words, so somebody's going to give a talk and they think about how is it going to affect the people in the room. Perfectly sensible, right? When we do a demonstration, we often think about how is it going to affect the people on the demonstration? How is it going to affect me being a part of the demonstration, whoever me is, right? We're much less good at thinking about how does it affect the rest of the country? How does it affect everybody? And so when my friends and I, in those days, I told you earlier about the decision to basically create chaos in Cambridge and Boston in hopes of spurring activity in Nevada or Kansas or whatever. It wasn't a genius move. I mean, at least it was strategic, I suppose I could say, but it was wrong. And at the time of that election, we played into Nixon's hands. We let him run a law and order campaign, and that won. most of the people in the country were willing to vote for him on the basis that McGovern would be chaos. And so our movement didn't do a good enough job of communicating that McGovern would just be a step, but it would be a step towards something really not chaos, but plenty, and you know, and that's what, to a degree, could happen now. So if Black Lives Matter had gone full on violent, I think Trump would have wrapped up the election. But it didn't. You know, there was elements of that, and a certain amount of the elements of that aren't Black Lives Matter people, they're infiltrators. I mean, that's real in the United States. If Trump can provoke riots before the election, that will be very, very damaging in the voting. And so that means that when we figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and also how we're going to talk, right? We should be taking into account the impact on others. I mean, people who write on the left, a great many people who write on the left are writing for leftists. They're not writing to be read or to be understood. They're certainly not writing to be understood, a lot of people who write, you know. That's an example of not being strategic about what you're doing. And so I'm not sure I can answer better than that. I am not a research type who has lots of facts at my disposal, so I can't tell you what McGovern got and what Nixon got and everything else. I can tell you this, Nixon and McGovern isn't even in the ballpark of what we have now. Because Trump isn't in the ballpark of Nixon. I mean, it's just not. So it's that much more important, and that much more important, therefore, for people to be careful about what they're doing and how they're doing it. Americans, that is. Activists. Anyway.
Time for another good question here. Can I,
Bridget, was that okay?
Go ahead, Michael.
Was that okay? All right.
Was it all right, Peter? Yeah. Bridget Meehan, do you want to come in for a question?
Yeah, okay. I'd put down two, but I suppose I'll ask the first one. Why do you think, Michael, there's so little written about vision and strategy? You know, you said there was the big pile that was about everything that's wrong, but there's so little written about vision and strategy.
Okay, while you were asking that question, I was reading your question over here in the chat. Unless I'm wrong, they were different. Am I right?
I have the one about the climate emergency, Bridget.
Yeah, that's what I have.
All right, yeah, there's one above that, but I can answer the one about the climate emergency, whichever one. I don't want to be greedy and take two questions.
Okay.
I had in mind the climate one.
And if you want, give me the other one. Okay, well, yes, I do think the climate emergency and the ecological emergency per se are having a dramatic effect on, well, some people they're causing to become anti-scientific because they want to defend the institutions that would have to be changed to do something about global warming. But other people are becoming awake to the fact that the planet is in real danger. And so they do become more receptive. I think that the global ecological circumstances are making people more susceptible to arguments that are systemic. Whether they make leftists more energetic about developing and presenting arguments that are more systemic, all right, and vision, I'm not so sure about. I hope so. I think it's starting to happen. Yeah, I do think that doomed to death by capitalism. Are we doomed to death by, well, I hope not. Maybe, you know, I'm not going to lie. Maybe, maybe we're doomed to death by capitalism. Maybe we're doomed to death by nuclear explosions. Maybe we're certainly doomed to death by age. So you shouldn't be that surprised that doomed to death. But I do think it's all, except that last one, reversible. I don't, you know, and I don't believe in apocalyptic organizing. I should maybe say that. I hate apocalyptic organizing. You know, the world's going to end, so join our demonstration. That's pretty common. It was very common in the United States. I'll give you an example. During the Vietnam War, one of the biggest and most important demonstrations was called May Day, and it was a demonstration where people went from all over to Washington. So it was the largest, it was basically a civil disobedience demonstration in Washington, D.C. to shut down the city. But the slogan was, if the government doesn't end the war, we're going to end the government. Something like that. And then there was another one, and there was another one. And the problem was that all the people who went and shut down Washington went home, and the war was still going on. And they all thought it was a loss. Right? So in other words, the mode of organizing and the mode of talking about what we were doing prepared people not to continue, but actually to wake up and be depressed and think that they had failed. And that's because in those days, we want the world and we want it now. The notion was you had to win everything in a leap, and you could, and that was wrong. It was going to take longer. And, you know, the same thing is true about global warming. If it causes people to think we have to go out and demonstrate, and if nobody responds, you know, if it doesn't end Exxon and all the rest overnight, we failed, and then you go home and be depressed and you give up. On the other hand, if you go out and you demonstrate and your goal is to reach more people, your goal is to come away with better infrastructure on the left and with more people aligned and with more understanding, and you see that, then you see success, and you do it again. These things that I'm saying might seem simplistic. They are. They are. Activism and winning change is not an intellectual nightmare, you know, where you need the, you know, 4 years or 8 years or 12 years of study to be able to understand it. The only thing that requires that is obscure writing and obscure, you know, noise that it requires a lot to understand. But actually understanding something about how the world works and something about, you know, how you win change, and even something about what a better world could be organized like and should be organized like, those aren't that hard of questions. They're just outside of our normal purview. Anyway, yes, I do think that the danger that is global warming, the danger that is resource depletion, the danger that is fascism, Trump, are all making the possibility of a movement which is not just about short-run reform, but also about long-run change possible. Not inevitable, but possible. I do think it's enhancing that possibility and probability, I guess.
Michael, if you're all right, just for one more question. I would like to finish on time, but the last one, Kieran, do you want to come in and ask that question there? Is Kieran still with us? There you are.
Gurm Waggett, Michael. That was fascinating talk there. I was just I saw a clip the other night in an interview with David Grieber, and he was talking about the extreme centre and how
slow down a wee, just slow it down a wee bit, Kieran.
The reason for that is I apologize. Usually if I'm with a French audience, I have to apologize for not speaking French, and at least it seems rational. You know, maybe I can be forgiven. But I have a lot of trouble with accents. I do, I'm sorry. And so it's very hard for me to understand some folks.
Apologies. I was asking there about, I saw a clip the other night with David Grieber, an activist from America who passed away recently. And he was talking about the extreme centre and how essentially neoliberalism in the centre of politics in the West and the hard right that's emerging are two sides of the one coin. And we saw with the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn by the right of his own party, and they saw the treatment of Bernie Sanders by the Democratic National Convention and stuff, and how they made it clear essentially that they would that they would rather kind of coalesce around fascism and the hard right in defense of capital. Does that tell us, in your view, that the battle for the future lies in defeating that kind of neoliberal extreme centre and not the recently resurgent hard right?
Well, yeah, you certainly have to defeat it. I think it's true. I think it's a fair reading that the heart of the Democratic Party was more afraid of Sanders than they were of Trump. And so that's pretty definitive right there. That sort of tells you why. Because Trump, okay, is fascism, but Sanders, that might be that we lose, that our power is dissipated, that our wealth is dissipated. So we're more worried about that. So yes, that's the old two wings of one party defending capital analysis, which is valid. So yes, that has to be defeated. But the notion that the way you defeat it, I mean, it's not so much that has to be defeated as that something better has to be enunciated and steal its thunder, right? I mean, we're not in a boxing match where we're going to box against these folks and beat them. And we're not in a physical battle, because if we bring a stick, they'll bring a better club. And if we bring a club, they'll bring a gun. And if we bring a pistol, they'll bring a rifle. And if we bring a rifle, they'll bring a fucking tank. You don't beat the state at that game. So what you have to beat the state at is appealing to the public, is reaching the public, empowering the public. So there are enough people, not only in motion, but knowing why they're in motion and knowing what they want. So it wasn't enough in Greece to have 40% of the country in the street. It would have been enough if that 40% of the country had a shared political conception, a shared ideology of what was needed and what was wanted in place of what existed. So yes, of course we have to overcome the status quo, the establishment, those who are both in the capitalist class and those who are supporting it. And we have to avoid succumbing to a new boss, coordinator class. We have to instead win something that is truly new. But that doesn't mean that we don't fight for reforms, right? Some people take this kind of perspective up to that point and they say, all right, that's what we need. That's what we have to win. And all this nonsense about winning higher wages isn't enough. All this nonsense about affirmative action, that's not enough. All this nonsense about, winning some climate changes, climate reforms, or whatever, that's not enough. Well, they're right, it's not enough, but they're wrong. It isn't part of the process that's necessary. They've forgotten that they didn't become radical and revolutionary in, 14 seconds. It took time. And they're also, and here I have to say, I mean, honestly, between the sincere liberal who wants to win higher wages and wants to win better conditions and wants to win some affirmative action and wants to get rid of some racist stuff and racist police and but doesn't have any, isn't interested in winning a new world, right? Between that person and a leftist who says, I want a new world, perhaps the world that I want, right? I want participatory socialism, I want participatory, etc., and sincerely means it, but also says, I don't give a shit about winning higher wages. I don't care about affirmative action. I don't care about all that stuff. All that stuff is just reforms, right? I'll take the first guy over the second guy, because the second person has simply lost touch with their humanity. They have simply, in an ideology, lost touch with the fact that people are suffering, and those gains, those victories matter and make people's lives better. They've also lost touch with the fact that they're part of building a movement, but just the fact that they can, and that's in the United States right now, that's the leftists who say, I don't care about beating Trump, that's not anything. Then we'd have the neoliberal Biden, you know, so that's nothing. We have to make a revolution. Well, they're out to, they're just both insensitive to the pain and suffering that is the difference between the two candidates. And they are also oblivious to the reality that revolution is not on the doorstep. The choice isn't Biden, Trump, or revolution. If it was, I'd line up for revolution, but it's not. And fooling ourselves to think it is part of what does us in. We have to work to make it on the agenda. It's not there now. Anyway.
Michael, can I just ask everyone to come off silent there and give a round of applause to Michael for his contribution tonight?
Brilliant.
Well done. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Interesting.
I hope it was useful, and
Yeah.
you know, anytime that I can be of help. If any of you want to write to me, if anything that I said, let's put it this way, if anything that I said strikes you as wrong or strikes you as incomplete, well, all of it was incomplete, so maybe that's not a good invitation. But if you wanna write, I answer all mail, and I'd be happy to answer and say you were involved in this, and that'll at least tell me, you know, why you're arriving in the mailbox. It's SYSOP, SYSOP. That's S like Sam, Y, S like Sam, OP at ZMAG. That's for Z magazine, but it's ZMag, not .org. That's my email, and I'm, you know, it's fun. I can't guarantee I can help you with whatever you ask, but I'll try.
Thanks, Michael. I think it is something that we kind of touched on leading up to this event as well, but we'd love to kind of keep touching. There's a lot of us kind of looking at existing forms of activism right now, and I suppose the necessity of them, but also the limitations of them as well, and trying to look at alternative institution building and how you go about that at a community level. That's really in cue with the festival that you're speaking at today. So we'd love to kind of hook up again in future about this, but for the evening that's in it, just thank you very much, Michael. It was insightful, it was inspiring, it was enjoyable. So listen, everybody, thanks. And I'm sure Fergal and Carraige and the crew at Glorna Mona will send around the video when it's up. And any other further events that we can pull Michael into to give us some advice and some reflections on, we'll let you know about it. But thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.